I'm therefore very pleased indeed, to be joined by two people who, in their different ways, have devoted themselves to researching what's usually lumped under the title the housing crisis. Anna Minton is a reader in architecture at the University of East London, and she's the author of Big Capital, Who is London For? And also with me is David Madden, who is Assistant Professor of Sociology at the London School of Economics and co-author of In Defence of Housing, The Politics of Crisis. Now, even before I start speaking to you, listen to your analysis, I suppose I'm very aware that, in common with many other Radio 4 listeners, that I've lived in what is, even allowing for mortgage repayments, a home of my own for many years, which is perhaps why I remember so well comedian Marcus Brigstock once rather cruelly suggesting that the housing crisis for Radio 4 listeners might mean that one was not sure what to do with Josh's room while he was away at university. To try to sort of remedy that imbalance a little tiny bit, Anna, let me ask you first about your interviews, because you conducted a number of interviews with people affected by the housing crisis. Tell me just a little bit about how they spoke about their predicament.
Home is about every aspect of who we are and how we live. And when your home is under threat, and when you don't know from day to day if you can afford to pay the rent, if you might be evicted at any time, it affects every aspect of your life and your sanity. Providing a home for your family, for the children, a roof over their heads, keeping them in the same community, close to their schools, this affects everything, and it is on people's minds the whole time. And I mean, you mentioned Josh, the middle class son of the parents. I mean, this is now affecting so many people across society. We're not just talking about people on low incomes. Actually, we're talking about today's Joshes who leave university and they have nowhere to live owing to such soaring rents and unaffordable prices.
Affordability, we talk about rental, there's a whole range of elements involved in this.
Actually, all of these elements are connected, because often what we hear in discussions of the housing crisis is if we could just get a few more people into home ownership, if we could build more social housing, if we could lower rents for students. Actually, all of these things are connected, and it all comes back to the complete financialisation of every aspect of housing.
But let's just turn to you, David, because I think you're a little bit wary of this term crisis, aren't you?
I think it can be a very powerful term politically, housing crisis, but I don't think we should use it uncritically. Some versions of this idea of housing crisis imply that the system is sort of broken and we need to return to a status quo, which is not seen as problematic for people. And I think that really misstates the issue. I mean, the housing problem as it exists today is fundamentally not a sign of the system breaking down. This is what the system looks like today. There are a lot of political proposals to sort of address the housing crisis that really end up reproducing the problem. We need to change the housing status quo, not sort of shore it up in places.
Thinking about this wider picture, because you, and it's interesting, I mean, you draw upon the title of your book, Big Capital. I mean, that's a nod to Thomas Piketty, isn't it? Thomas Piketty's analysis of inequalities in contemporary world.
Well, that's right. And I mean, his underpinning thesis is that in the contemporary economy, the income from rent or property, to use a term more people will be able to understand, the income from property is greater than the income from economic growth and wages. So most of us actually who might be are lucky enough to own our own homes will earn more money just from sleeping than we will from going to work.
I remember something you said about the cost of a chicken.
The level of house price inflation we have seen in the last 50 years, if the cost of food prices had mapped the cost of property price inflation, a chicken today would cost £50. And that same chicken in London would, by the way, cost £100 because London prices have been going at twice the pace of the rest of the country.
David, I mean, when we're talking here about housing somehow being seen as an asset, primarily as an asset, rather than something that's a public good, I mean, you, in your book, you want to use the Marxist language of use value and exchange value to capture this. Tell me a little bit more about the usefulness of those terms.
Exchange value is basically the amount of profit you can gain from something. Use value refers to all of the other possible uses So in the field of housing, exchange value is essentially treating housing as real estate, whereas the idea of use value gets at all the different ways in which people use their homes, and for family life, for community life, for cultural life. And what we see now is the process that social scientists call commodification, where exchange value comes to dominate all of the other possible uses of housing. And we can see this transforming and mutating the housing system, affecting what's being built, affecting the way housing is distributed, and affecting the way that people are able to use their homes. It's a global problem, and it takes different forms in different places.
I mean, arguably, it's at its peak in a city like London and in other British cities. I think we're right on the cusp of these global forces. I mean, for sure, we're seeing it in other North American cities, Vancouver, New York, which you've written about, San Francisco. And when we talk about this flood of global capital which is coming into a city like London, actually that is having an impact, even in the very wealthiest places like Kensington and Chelsea, the so-called alpha areas. Wealth comes into these places. Properties are now going for sort of 20, 30 million pounds, inconceivable prices. Those people can no longer afford to live there. They might move to the country. They buy their children properties in London, but not in the areas that they grew up in, but further out. Places which were once not considered so fashionable, like Acton or Peckham or Forest Gate. Those places witness a rise in prices and unaffordability, and people get pushed out of the city altogether and then into South Coast towns, Margate, Hastings, Folkestone.
Definitely, it affects everyone, but it doesn't affect everyone equally, and it's very uneven, the consequences of this process. But they're also not only concentrated in London. I mean, in cities throughout the UK, you have investors who maybe previously had been searching for real estate profits in London, now going there and reshaping the local housing systems there.
Absolutely. I mean, a city like Manchester or Bristol, privy to exactly the same pressures and exactly the same influx of foreign investment into the centre of those cities, and the same luxury towers going up.
Anna, you've been talking about the pace of change. Not really anything particularly new going on here. Here are some words found in Frederick Engel's The Housing Question. This goes right back to 1872.
What is meant today by housing shortage is the peculiar intensification of the bad housing conditions of the workers as a result of the sudden rush of population to the big towns, a colossal increase in rents, a still further aggravation of overcrowding in individual houses, and for some, the impossibility of finding a place to live in at all. And this housing shortage gets talked of so much only because it does not limit itself to the working class, but has affected the petty bourgeoisie also.
You, I think, found those words, David, didn't you, and used them in your book. They certainly don't sound out of place today in view of what Anna's been talking about.
No, certainly. I mean, this is a famous passage in critical housing studies where Engels is talking about, first, the slipperiness of the concept of crisis, and the fact that many attempts to solve the housing crisis end up reproducing it. And it's incredibly contemporary. A lot of the techniques that were tried in the late 19th century to address the housing question are still being used today. I mean, another famous line, he says that the way the bourgeoisie solves the housing crisis is just by moving it around. We can definitely see this in cities like London today, where people who are inadequately housed, working class and poor communities are being displaced. The problem is being moved elsewhere.
Let's go back to those attempts to try to give people houses of their own. I mean, it's something the government's often talked about over the years. I think in the recent budget, at the end of last year, the Chancellor pledging to exempt first-time buyers from stamp duty for properties up to £300,000, so more people can have their own homes. But perhaps the most famous move to give people their own homes, of course, is the famous right to buy, which was a key Conservative policy back in the 1980s. Here's Margaret Thatcher in 1979.
We will give to every council tenant the right to purchase his own home at a substantial discount of market price and with a 100% mortgage for those who need it. This will be a giant stride towards making a reality of Anthony Eden's dream of a property-owning democracy. And it'll do something else. It will give to more of our people that freedom and mobility, that prospect of handing something on to their children and grandchildren, which owner occupation provides.
Now, Anna, tell me a little bit more about the right to buy, the consequences and why it matters in the housing story. We're going to be focusing on England here because I think in Scotland the right to buy was scrapped back in 2016. This was something that was very much welcomed by some and very much attacked by others. Tell me a little bit more about how it affects what we now call the housing crisis.
I mean, the impact of the right to buy cannot be underestimated. I think it's the single most important factor before the financial crisis behind our contemporary housing crisis. The right to buy saw the sell-off of well in excess of 2 million council homes. Now, that in itself was not necessarily a bad thing. It did lead to a very welcome redistribution of wealth. The really big problem with it was that councils were not allowed to use the money raised from those sales to build new homes. So we lost essentially more than 2 million council homes. So that is one of the main reasons why there is such a shortage of homes. We stopped building homes, i.e. bricks, and we started subsidising people to live in social housing through paying them housing benefit. But what we've seen in recent years is that actually that housing benefit no longer covers the amount of rent that people need. So people keep getting evicted. When this policy shift was initially laid out, housing benefit was supposed to cover rents in social housing. But since 2009, 2010, it's slowly been cut in an attempt to get the housing benefit bill down. But that hasn't worked because private rents are so high. The housing benefit bill just keeps soaring and is nearly £10 billion now a year. So it's a completely nonsensical policy. And if you think back to those 2 million council homes which were sold off, actually now many of those are rented out by private landlords at 3 and 4 times the price. And you see this situation where councils which are desperate for social housing actually have to rent back what used to be their own properties from the private landlords at these much, much higher prices.
David, you want to come in?
Rolling out of the right to buy was a key moment for understanding housing history in this country, partly because it was aimed precisely at dismantling this alternative part of the housing sector that wasn't tied to private landlordism, that wasn't tied to individual ownership. And it also delegitimized the idea of public housing politically.
But when given the opportunity to own their own place, the idea itself became an almost universally popular idea, didn't it?
Private ownership of housing is a very strongly privileged form of tenure. And so in a system where there's great inequality between different tenures, you can obviously understand why people would want to occupy the privileged position rather than the ones that are being attacked and undermined. But it pushed the housing system as a whole towards a much more unjust place.
So when you want to talk about ontological insecurity, not having your own place.
The phrase itself was coined by the Scottish radical psychiatrist R.D. Laing, and it refers to the sense that the stability of the world can be taken for granted. And it also points to the anxiety and indeed the sense of personal crisis that results from living in insecure conditions. I mean, the number of mental health problems that stem from this, interpersonal problems, family strife, the ways in which precarious housing undermines your sense of being at ease in the world.
I mean, there are some people, perhaps, who want to be exempted from this idea of owning their own house, having their own property, who almost choose some sort of insecurity. I mean, we had that little item on earlier about sort of squatters. I mean, here are people saying, well, perhaps we should have other ways of residing. Perhaps we shouldn't place so much emphasis upon owning our own place. What is your reaction?
There have always been and there always will be people who want to explore other ways of living alternative to the mainstream. But I think in a discussion on the housing crisis, the proportion of people who actively choose to live in an alternative way
or who want to live in an alternative
is very small compared to the arguably millions of people who are suffering on a daily basis because they're spending more than 50% of their income on rent. The problems are just of a different scale. Now, it's interesting that has actually paralleled a ban in alternative living such as squatting. So it's this emphasis on financialisation in every aspect of the property market, which has actually seen alternative ways of doing things made illegal.
In my simple-minded sort of economic way, though, if I look at what, say, the government has just been doing, we had a recent budget, which pledged £44 billion, I think, in overall government support for housing, talking about having a target of 300,000 new homes a year by the middle of the next decade. If you have more houses, then surely don't laws of supply and demand mean that you're going to have reductions in prices?
Well, you only need to look around the London skyline to see we're building plenty of homes. 300 residential tower blocks going up all around London and in other cities. But those are not homes that Londoners can afford. David mentioned, that actually looking at this as a housing crisis can actually be unhelpful, because actually what we need to do is we need to look at housing in a completely different way. I mean, what the government has announced is all of this help for getting people onto the housing ladder, helping them into shared ownership schemes, giving subsidies, taking away stamp duty. That's just going to raise prices further. They have to get out of that ideological straitjacket which says we can only look at market solutions. My first step would be to look at some of the solutions that countries all over the world look at, such as land value taxation, which is used in countries such as Australia, Hong Kong, parts of America, hardly bastions of socialism.
You can build more homes, but unless you change the ways in which housing is distributed and occupied, nothing's going to prevent powerful elites from monopolizing more housing and using it for speculation and for investment. So you need social housing, you need cooperative housing, you need housing that people can actually live in, and housing that will be distributed not on the basis of who can pay for it, but on the basis of who needs housing, which is everyone.
David Madden and Anna Minton, thank you very much.